Press. I'm your host, Riley Bounds, and this is the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern renaissances in evangelical literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation. Today I'm excited to have author Ryan Rickrode on the podcast. Sometimes funny, sometimes sad, often both. Ryan Rickrode's stories feature striking images and memorable characters who often waver between strength and despair. He believes that writing fiction is a way of asking questions and pursuing answers. Rickrode is the associate fiction editor at Solum Press and a writer from central Pennsylvania. He earned his MFA from the University of Montana in 2013 and is currently a visiting assistant professor of English and creative writing at Susquehanna University. His novella, The Mountains May Depart, was a 2019 finalist for the Clay Reynolds Novella Prize and a 2020 honorable mention for the Landmark Prize for Fiction. He is currently finishing up a novel that retells and weaves together a number of dark fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. You can find links to all Rickrode's published work at Ryan-Rickrode, that's RICKRODE.com. More information will be given in the show notes, including a link to his bio on the Solum website and his personal website if you want to find out more. So Ryan, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So just tell us about yourself, namely, how did you come to Christ?
All right. So I think I wrote in a memoir once, I was baptized as an infant and sort of brought to church every Sunday when I was growing up. But I didn't really become a Christian until I went through a period of doubt as a high school student. I had gone through a breakup and was feeling generally lonely at the time. And then for Christmas, some well-meaning relative got me a copy of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which I guess that kind of dates me now. But I got halfway through that book. It's a thriller. It's a page turner. Every chapter is about, I think, a paragraph long. And so you're turning these pages, wanting to know what happens next. And halfway through the mystery, there's this historian character. It's a novel, but there's this historian character who basically tells the protagonist and explains that everything the church has said about Jesus was basically made up by the emperor Constantine. And when I read that, I had suddenly realized for the first time in my life, I had no idea where Christianity came from or anything about the roots and foundations of my faith. And it really scared me. I felt like I was, suspended in the abyss or something like that. And so I had this a couple months of really intense doubt where I took the Da Vinci Code and I hid it in my sock drawer. I didn't even want to look at it. And I would often go to the mall to see movies with friends, and I would go to it was a Borders bookstore. We still had Borders. I'm sounding so old on this podcast. But I would go to the Borders, and there was a book there called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, which I think is a fairly well-known book, but it was I must have heard about it in Sunday school. Lee Strobel was a reporter, and I think his wife converted to Christianity, and he thought, man, she's not going to be any fun anymore. And so he did all this research to try to dissuade her from her beliefs and ended up converting himself. And then this book is a series of interviews that kind of recreates that journey with a bunch of different scholars. And so I would go to this Borders and I would take the book off the shelf and I would look at it and then I would put it back on the shelf because I was afraid the answers wouldn't be good enough. I did that for a long time, for a couple months, but you can't live in doubt forever. And so I finally bought the book and I took it home and I loved it. I mean, these scholars, they weren't scared or intimidated or cagey when he would ask these really hard questions about, the history of the New Testament and things like that. They almost talked about it like sports fans. They were excited to talk about these questions. And so I flew through that book, and then I read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And then I read, I guess it was a seminary textbook, one of those big footnoted books, but it was called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels by a scholar named Craig Blomberg, or Bloomberg. I don't know how he says it. But then after I read those three books, I decided that Jesus is the real deal. The resurrection was a historical event. I want to give my life to Christ. And so I was baptized for a second time, but as an adult by choice, actually in a creek, shortly before my 18th birthday. And then when I went on to college, I studied not just creative writing, but also religious studies, because I had just really found that asking questions could be an act of faith. Like that was really like a paradigm shift for me to realize that, God doesn't always answer our questions, but he kind of always meets us in the asking. And so I did religious studies as my second major at a Lutheran university, where I had a lot of sort of friends who were pre-sem. And so it was a lot of biblical studies and things like that.
Yeah, I love that asking questions as an act of faith. I love that. And it delights me that you, as a literary person, have found your way by help of apologetics. That's what we're trying to promote here at Solum, is the intersection of literature and philosophy. So, and philosophy undergirds apologetics. So I'm so grateful. And obviously I'm grateful that you found your way like that. So, when did you start writing?
I think I've always been writing. If you would ask my mother, I think she says she has, all sorts of little, bits and pieces of drawings with stories on them and things like that. I really first decided I wanted to be a writer when I was in 5th grade. We were all supposed to write stories, and I got to read mine aloud to the class, and everyone laughed at the funny parts. And so I think the rest of my life has been just a pursuit of more positive attention like that in some ways. But yeah, I've just always been a writer, wanted to be a writer, and have always sort of written.
So were there any authors that when you were growing up that particularly influenced you?
As a kid, probably one of my most formative experiences was that my mother read The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien to my brother and I, a little bit by bit each night, which kind of amazes me that she committed to such a long book. Although she did not go on to the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy afterwards. But she read that, Watership Down, what else? And then a lot of my early writing, like as a kid, were like knockoffs of like Jules Verne and Roald Dahl. Those were some of the writers I really liked as a kid.
Mm-hmm. And as you were growing up, were there any others that kind of stuck with you?
As I started to sort of develop my style, I think James Agee, the way he writes, he's a really lyrical sort of writer. I really like Marilyn Robinson, the way she sort of writes about sort of faith in fiction. I don't know. There's a million writers I could name. I don't want to just make a big long list, but those are two writers who helped me think about how I approach fiction.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now the other day I read your essay, Images of the Invisible, and in there you mentioned that as a kid you feared Jesus because of his kind of wrathful portrayals by your childhood Lutheran church. And I hope I'm not mischaracterizing your church. I don't want to step on anybody's toes.
Yeah, I would say it's not so much the Lutheran aspect as it was the giant, terrifying, sort of angry-sounding organ that we would have at church every Sunday. And when you're a kid, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You're like, what is going on? The organ like will blow your hair back. It was a very liturgical church, obviously, since it was Lutheran. And I didn't really understand that, which is kind of funny because my wife and I now are just really steeped in the Anglican tradition and have really come to value liturgy. But it was more like the strangeness of it and that organ.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I've actually converted over to Anglicanism too as I've gotten older. So I feel you. But do you feel that that fear that you express in the essay, do you feel that influenced your approach to your writing in Christian-themed pieces as you got older?
I think it's made me just as a Christian and as a reader of the Bible really appreciative, and I have a high value for putting things in historical context. That's kind of what that whole essay is about. Like, why is Jesus in art so often portrayed as a glowy white guy? Right? If he was a glowy white guy, Judas probably wouldn't have had to kiss him. He would have stood out. He would have just pointed. You see the guy who's like lit up like a nightlight. So I don't know. It's made me value the Gospels a lot. I think my wife is a campus minister, and she's observed some of her students are like, okay, yeah, the Gospels, but let's get into the epistles. Like that's where the really heavy stuff is. And she's like, no. Like you want to look at Jesus. And so I guess just as a Christian, it's shaped me in that way. And I guess too, it's driven me to write in my writing to ask questions again, because that's kind of how I came to faith.
Right. Yeah. I've always, growing up, I always wondered like how, the white Jesus, the portrayals of that. I always wondered how he didn't die of melanoma out there, in the blistering heat.
In the desert for 40
right.
days.
Yeah. So.
You would think he'd be more tan.
Yeah, exactly. So has your approach to writing kind of changed as you developed a more like accurate and intimate picture of Jesus?
Yeah, I think it's made me more comfortable with ambiguity, with exploring sort of doubt and difficulties, the difficulties of faith in my fiction, in my nonfiction. And I think too, it's made me resistant to like didactic forms of storytelling. I really think fiction should ask questions and sort of seek out sort of organic answers as opposed to sort of deliver like a predetermined message. I'm really kind of allergic to that sort of thing.
I didn't write this down in the questions beforehand, but that reminds me, we studied Flannery O'Connor's pieces back in my writing undergrad. And one of the big problems that my writing teacher expressed was she thought that Flannery O'Connor was too didactic, even though she was brilliant. Have you read much Flannery O'Connor?
Yeah, I've read and enjoyed Wise Blood, and I've read What a Good Man is Hard to Find. That whole book. I love A Good Man is Hard to Find. That particular short story. I think that ending really embodies. She always talked about wanting to end her stories with a moment that's both in character and beyond character, and I think that definitely accomplishes it. That with the misfit, right? So what does he say? She would have been a good woman if there'd been someone to shoot her every day of her life. I don't know. That story in particular, I really love, and the story that comes right after it, the river, which is just so haunting. And I don't want to say too much about it if no people haven't read it yet. But I don't know. I feel sometimes mixed about Flannery O'Connor. She seems. I want to like her. I feel like I should, as a Christian who's a writer. I should be a big fan, and I like a lot of what she's written. But sometimes her stories feel like, man, like she's kind of mean to her characters. I don't know. I really like to root for the characters that I'm reading about. I don't know.
Yeah. But did you feel that she was too didactic with her moral messages and kind of evangelism?
No, I don't. I wouldn't say I felt that she was didactic. Just a little brutal sometimes. I wouldn't want to ask Flannery O'Connor what she thought of my haircut, because she'd tell me.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor might be kind of a tough friend to have. Do you feel closer to God when you write?
That's a really interesting question. I think I would say yes and no. A lot of both my essays and my fiction, my stories are question driven. I'm sort of trying to figure something out. I'm sort of seeking understanding. And so I think I often feel closer to God after I've finished, like when I've reached some sort of conclusion, when I've seen how things work out for these characters, or when I've sort of weighed all the ideas in an essay. I think then afterwards, sometimes I feel closer to God because I've asked that question and I've worked through it and I've sort of held it up in my writing and I've thought about it. Like for example, in some of my stories, it'll be like the novella, The Mountains May Depart. It's about this couple who's lost a child, and they're both grieving and they're both angry at each other. And so the question that drove that story is like, what has to happen for this couple to reconcile with each other, right? Because it's sort of about them reaching that point where either they're going to reconcile or fall apart. And so, right, it switches back and forth between their perspectives, sort of saying like, well, how does this person's actions affect this person? How is this person misinterpreting what's happening here? And you sort of work your way back and forth, and you're like, oh wow, like this is how it plays out.
Just offhand, would you explain the title, "The Mountains May Depart"?
Yeah, the mountains made apart is it's a verse from Isaiah. I believe it's from Isaiah. It's been a while since I've worked on that novella, and I've tried out 100 different titles before I came to that one. But the novella is set in Missoula, Montana, which is a city that's right up against the mountains. And it's in some ways, I like the ambiguity of the title, that it's the mountains could be like these troubles that they are facing, and maybe these mountains will depart. I think the original verse in Isaiah, I'd have to look it up, but I think it's something like God's love is like the mountains may depart, but God's love will remain.
Okay, yeah, that was a great choice. It works very well. So, what was your first publication, and where was it placed?
It was a story I wrote as an undergrad called "We Are the Pretty," and it was published in an online literary magazine called Identity Theory.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I might have read that one. What was it like? What was it like for you as you got published for the first time?
In some ways, it was anticlimactic. It's like your whole your life you want to get published, and there it is, and it's out there, and people can read it, and there was no big parade, there were no fireworks or anything, but it was still satisfying. It was the first story for a long time as an undergrad, going through workshops, and there's this emphasis on you can revise, and there's always something you can do to make it better. When I sent that story out, that was the first time I'd ever felt I'd actually finished a story. And I don't even quite know how to put into words like what it means to know that a story is finished. There's a poet, and I'm sure other people have said this, but the poet G.C. Waldrop once said at a reading I went to that he never really finishes anything; he just abandons it at key moments. And I thought, like, well, that will be how it is for me too. But that was the first time I felt I had brought a story to completion, and I'm sure if I would look back at it now, there's all sorts of things I would want to change, but I'd gotten it to a point where it's like, this is it. I don't want to sort of rewrite the whole thing. I don't want to pull it apart. I'm ready to start submitting it to magazines.
Awesome. So would you consider yourself more of a fiction writer or an essayist?
I'm definitely more drawn towards fiction. I study both fiction and nonfiction in my MFA program. I teach a lot of creative nonfiction classes, but I tend to be more drawn towards fiction, and I think that might be because of the questions I have. A lot of my nonfiction, my essays are sort of driven by intellectual kind of questions, whereas the questions I have now are a lot about like how do you live your life, and I think fiction is often a vehicle more suited to answering those kind of questions or exploring those questions.
Right. What do you normally write your essays on?
All sorts of things. I guess whatever I have a question about. I mean, I really think, and I stress this with my writing students, that you want to write essays on things that you don't know the answer to. I really think essays should be about thinking on the page. And that goes back to like the history of the essay. It comes from a French word that means to try or attempt, where you're trying out sort of different ways of thinking about a topic. It actually goes back all the way to a Latin word that means to weigh, as in to sort of weigh different metals. And so I often tell my students when they're writing an essay, you want to weigh different points of view and sort of think through things and throw out a lot of possibilities and work your way towards this really genuine conclusion, right? In other like academic essays, right, your conclusion is basically just your intro paragraph, right? Copy and pasted and put at the end, at least in undergrad. Whereas in a literary essay, your conclusion is this genuine conclusion. And so my essays have tended to be about sort of faith-related questions. We mentioned that piece where I'm really bothered by these non-historically accurate, portrayals of Jesus. I've written an essay about sort of evolution as a problem of theodicy and sort of weighing that. Does that get at the question?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you find it harder to write essays than fiction?
Sometimes. Again, like I tend to just gravitate more towards fiction. I think again because of the questions I'm interested in and the sort of writing I want to do. I just find myself more interested in telling stories. But also in creative nonfiction, there's like this high demand. You have to be really willing to be vulnerable, to be honest with the reader, to sort of be this sort of total openness, particularly in memoir, but also in essays. And so I don't know, you can do sort of similar things in fiction, but you have that cloak of, semi-autobiographical fiction, where you can sort of write about these things and explore them with maybe a little more distance. And you're also sort of free to change things around. You're not sort of bound, just to the facts.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think the purpose of writing fiction is?
I think the purpose of writing fiction is to give the reader an experience that's worth their time. I really think about stories as experiences we as readers get to have. The novelist John Gardner, in his craft book, The Art of Fiction, he says that the goal of the fiction writer is to create a vivid, continuous dream in the mind of the reader. So like the best books, I think, are the ones where when you're reading, you forget that you're looking at words on the page and you just start to experience the story. You just kind of lose yourself. Time flies by. And so I don't know, I think that's what fiction should do. It should give us this experience. I'm a big believer in it's called transactional reader response theory. It was developed by a theorist named Louise Rosenblatt, where she sort of suggests that stories and poems, they're almost like sheet music, where the writer creates them, but they don't really become an actual story, right? The text is just a bunch of black marks on a white page, and it doesn't come to life until a reader comes along and reads it. It's kind of incomplete until a reader comes and I almost think about it like in Genesis, where God breathes life into Adam, right? He's lifeless until God comes along, and readers, I think, sort of do something similar for stories.
Along with that, what is the purpose of writing fiction as a Christian?
So I think for me, again, it's about creating an experience. As a religious studies major, one of the things I studied was this idea of sacred space. And so sometimes I think about stories as sacred spaces. In the book of Exodus, you've got this guy Bezalel, who God tells Moses he's appointed to design and to create the tabernacle. And so as a Christian who's a writer, I sometimes think about myself in that sort of role where I'm sort of designing this sacred space. I'm creating this experience for the reader to enter into and have, right? Because Bezalel, he's not of the priestly tribe, so he's designing this beautiful, ornate space where people will go to encounter God, but those people won't be him. And so I think about that as a writer, that I'm creating these spaces that a reader can enter and experience some sort of felt truth, where they'll sort of feel some sort of emotional truth, or they'll feel the truth of something. And it doesn't have to be an explicitly Christian truth for me for it to be a Christian story. I think all truth belongs to God. And so that's kind of how I think about it.
Your fiction is extremely diverse thematically and in terms of the subjects that you write on. Did that versatility come naturally to you as you were developing in your writing, or did you have to kind of work at it?
That's an interesting question, because I guess because a lot of my fiction is like rooted in my own life experiences, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of diverse material. It seems like it's all like, well, I lived through something like that. I've met a person kind of like that. I've done this sort of job. I've been to this sort of place. In some ways, though, like as I think about writing stories that I'd like to one day sort of bring together in a collection, I don't want every story to be, told from the same point of view, from the person in sort of a similar circumstance. And so it is a little bit, I suppose, a choice on my part to try to write about people, men and women, old people, young people, people at different stages in their life. So that is a little bit of a deliberate choice. But also it's all just sort of drawn from my life. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I feel like you maybe see more diversity in it than I do. Maybe I'm too close to it.
How do you enter the mindset of all these characters that you write?
I just ask myself, how would I feel in this situation if I was this sort of person in this sort of situation? How would I feel? How would I react? There's a Catholic short story writer named Andre Dubus, who's a great essay about this. I can't remember the title of the essay, but he talks about how he would try so hard to imagine what is it like to be this person, right down to The example he gives is like, how does a glass of beer feel in their hands? And he was formerly in the military, a bigger guy, and he recognizes that a glass of beer in his hand would feel different than, a 120-pound woman would hold a glass of beer, and it would feel differently. And he would get down to that sort of level of imagining, what does the world look like from this point of view? And then he would just sort of follow his characters and see what they do next.
Is there a process to how you go about gaining insights on your characters? Do you go around talking to people personally, or do you just research online, or what's kind of your process with that?
I think mostly I just observe people and wonder what would it be like? Like, what is their life like? How do they see things? This is how they speak. This is how they react to things. Right, and I'm sure the creations I come up with, right, are not how they would actually think, right? But it's something different, but it's not quite me and it's not quite them. But it's different enough that it doesn't just sound like every character is, just versions of the same person, I hope. I don't know. There's not like a trick to it. I don't know. I just kind of do it without thinking. I do one thing the practical thing that I find helpful is when I write drafts, and I do multiple drafts. And the first draft is sometimes just about getting down, like what happens, like just sort of roughly sketching out how something goes. And then the next draft is maybe about getting the emotions right and being like, oh no, they wouldn't be angry there. They would actually be really embarrassed or something like that. And then the next draft maybe is about getting all the visual details that will really draw the person in. And maybe the next draft is about making sure the sentences all sound good and that you take out all those extra words that you don't need. And so I find it helpful too in terms of like getting into the heads of the characters to maybe save that for a second draft, to sort of go through it, but then to revisit it and where I can really focus on it. Because it's hard to do everything at once. And that's what you kind of have to do when you write a story. You have to be describing things and thinking what the characters were doing, but then also you have to be thinking about the plot and what's going to happen. And you don't want to just write terrible sounding sentences. So I find it helpful to give myself permission to focus on one thing at a time as I move through multiple drafts.
Do you find it hard to write about such different kinds of people, or does it just kind of come easily to you?
I think I enjoy it. I like sort of thinking about how different people perceive things in different ways. A lot of my longer works, I mentioned that in The Mountains Made Apart, it's about this couple and it alternates his point of view, her point of view. And I find it fascinating the way like someone thinks they can, what they think is a loving gesture can be interpreted as like a hostile gesture by the other person if they're not in a good place. And the way different people perceive different things. Or the novel I'm finishing up right now, which is based on a lot of fairy tales. I find it interesting the way that everyone's kind of the hero of their own story. And then when we switch points of view, suddenly that protagonist is the MacGuffin to this other character, right? The object of the quest, as opposed to a living, breathing human being. And the way people perceive things in different ways. And fairy tales have lots of interesting class dynamics in them. And so you can see how the things look to someone who doesn't have much versus someone who has, more than they'll ever need. I don't know. I find perspective really interesting to play around with.
I noticed that a lot of your fiction is told from children's perspectives. Is there a reason for that?
That's a really interesting observation. I don't think I've ever noticed that before. The only answer I could think of is that, I was a kid once. And so that's a point of view that, I, in theory, know pretty well. I find it harder to write about people who are, in their 50s, because that's not a life stage I've reached yet, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, but it is interesting now that you pointed out. I have several stories that sort of focus on that more childlike point of view.
Right. Do you generally prefer writing about kids when you're crafting those stories, or do you just prefer kind of writing more about adults?
I think it depends on the story. I mean, you just pick the character that makes sense for the story that you need to tell. The kids are kind of fun because they both like know more about the world and less about the world than adults do. Like in some ways they're more honest. They can sort of see through, some of our BS as adults. But then also there's this wonderful opportunity for dramatic irony where kids, they don't know how the world works, or they misinterpret things in really interesting ways.
Mhm. Who's your favorite character that you've written so far?
I think that probably changes depending on what I'm working on. Right now, it's probably the one of the two protagonists from the novel. Um, the character's name is Aiden. Like I said, it's a novel based on a lot of fairy tales. And so she's this princess on the run. It's kind of a fairy tale thriller, right? She's like Cinderella in The Fugitive, or Snow White in the 39 Steps, something like that. But there's all these people tracking her down. And the thing that keeps giving away her identity is that when she touches people, she can heal their sickness and their illness, kind of like Christ in the Gospels, or I think it's King Edward in Macbeth is also able to do that for his subjects. And so she does this, and people are like, "Oh, we know who you are." And to me, that makes her a really interesting character. She's a Christian, sort of was raised by a priest, and so she knows the story of Jesus. She knows the Gospels, and she knows that, like, as a Christian, she's kind of supposed to live that out. But also, she struggles with that, like with wanting to live out that narrative. And I find that a really interesting tension to explore.
Mm. Do your stories always have a Christian theme to them explicitly, or does it kind of vary depending on the story?
I think if you are a Christian, most of your themes, the way you see the world, will be Christian. Like, even if it's not explicitly a Christian story, or doesn't have explicit Christian characters. And I can't remember if it's Flannery O'Connor or Madeleine L'Engle who sort of says, I think it's Madeleine L'Engle in a book called Walking on Water, where she says that, if you're a Christian, your art will be Christian. It doesn't matter if if you have a lot of Bible verses in it or not. That said, I find it really interesting to think about as a writer, like the technical challenge of how do you portray Christian characters for an audience that's primarily secular, who might not understand where these characters are coming from. And one way to do it, you see a lot of writers will sort of write about like faith from a distance, where you have sort of a non-Christian character sort of brushes up against some sort of religious character, and it kind of alters the trajectory of their life. They kind of think about it. My favorite example of that, the Irish writer Frank O'Connor has a story called Man of the World. And it's all about his really cool friend who seems so much more worldly and cool than him. And he invites this kid over there. He said, I want you to come spend the night at my house. There's this new married couple just moved in across the street, and they don't have any curtains in their bedroom. And this narrator is like, he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to do this. He thinks this is wrong, to spy on the neighbors like this. But his friend is so cool that he feels like he can't say no. And as they climb up the stairs, and they look out through the attic window to spy on this couple, and what they see them doing isn't having sex. They see them doing their evening prayers. And it just fills the narrator with so much shame that he realizes, I don't want to be a worldly person like this at all. And that's kind of where the story ends. And so that's one way to do it. Another way to do it, I think, in a way that I'm really interested in, is sort of that sort of psychological realism, where you're trying to portray, like, you write a character from the inside, a character who's a believer. And I think Marilyn Robinson is a writer who does that really well in books like Gilead. There's a line in Gilead, a term that the narrator, who's this elderly minister, he talks about this idea of earned innocence. And he says it's different than the innocence of children who don't understand the world, but they think someday they will. And he says, I'm an old man, and I'm like amazed by the world, and I know I'm never going to understand it. And so I have this earned innocence. And I think I think you have to be willing to engage with doubt, and bring like characters experience that, and let characters struggle with their faith in ways that seem honest, to make it feel, I think, authentic to readers.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good way to put it. Now, in your narrative structure, you vary it quite a bit. Do you think that the elements of conventional modern fiction should be generally followed, or do you think that the rules of fiction were kind of made to be broken?
I think the only real rule is that you have to keep the reader's attention. For me, as a writer, even when I write sentences, I tend to not want to put a period at the end of the sentence. I tend to want to put an em dash or a comma and let my sentence keep going, because I don't want to give the reader an excuse to check their phone, or to pull up a YouTube video or something like that. I feel really conscious of like just how short modern attention spans are. And so I think that's the only real rule. Again, it goes back to that idea from John Gardner for me, that idea that fiction should be a vivid, continuous dream in the mind of the reader. And continuous means not giving them an excuse to put it down. And vivid means, right, that they forget that they're sitting in a chair, right, looking at a book, right? They feel like they're immersed in a story. And so for me, I think vivid detail is often really important, details that are sensory or specific that kind of draw the reader in, especially if you can get like one or two great details that kind of evoke a whole scene. I think character is really important. I want to have characters that I can empathize with, not necessarily characters who are like me, but characters who I can root for and understand. And I think plot too is kind of, I think plot is important. I think sometimes it's undervalued in literary fiction. But plot is, right, it creates suspense, it creates curiosity, it can create dread if you're reading like a Greek tragedy or watching a horror movie, right, that don't go down in the basement feeling. And plot, I think, is part of how stories express their meaning. We see a character, right, go through a bunch of things, like they make choices and we see what happens to them. And that's part of where fiction gets its meaning. And that for me, plot is that kind of cause and effect that drives a narrative forward. So I think all those things are important tools, and language too. Obviously you want sentences, like I said, that are interesting and engaging, or a voice that people will listen to. I think humor can be a great tool. I often use humor in my stories. But I don't think there are rules necessarily. I think the only rule is don't waste the reader's time, right? Don't let them check for text messages, right? Keep them focused on the story you're telling.
Right. Now you also teach writing in addition to writing it. Would you say that there's an objective standard by which we say this is good fiction or this is bad fiction?
No, I don't think so. I think it's about experiences. Again, to that idea of like transactional reader response theory, right, where stories are experiences we as readers get to have. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called An Experiment in Criticism, and he makes this interesting argument that we should judge books based on the experiences they give us. Like, what kind of reading experience is it? And that bad books give us like one sort of experience, and that good books give us a deeper, more immersive sort of experience. But I don't know how you would quantify that. Lewis even says that you, like, even if you read something and it doesn't work for you, that just means it didn't work for you. That doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. It's really hard to, sometimes know if something for sure was objectively good or bad. But in the context of teaching writing, I think it's really helpful to have like models of like, here's a lot of different ways to do it, right? Let's read a lot of different, whatever genre you're teaching, right? If it's, right, if you're teaching creative nonfiction, let's read a lot of different types of memoirs and a lot of different essays that use a lot of different structures and a lot of different techniques, so that we can see what all the possibilities are. And then I think it's helpful too to have a shared vocabulary, so that when you start talking about the pieces being workshopped, people are all on the same page. You're not talking past each other or something like that. That we can talk about, like, this is what we mean by voice, or if it's in an intro class, even like basic terms that maybe we take for granted of defining of dialogue and things like that, is good, so that everyone is talking to each other. And I think too, it's really important to create this sort of collaborative atmosphere in the workshop. The way I usually run a workshop class is I'll start by asking the writer. In some workshops, it's pretty strict, right, where the writer's supposed to go and sit quietly and not say anything. And I don't find that, particularly in working with younger writers, I don't think that's the best approach. I like to ask the writer at the beginning, so where do you feel like you're at in your process? And 9 times out of 10, the writer will say, I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. It's definitely not done. But I feel like that's a chance for them to acknowledge to the rest of the class that this is a work in progress, that it's okay to critique it. They know it's not like, they're not holding it up as like the best story ever. It gives them a chance to kind of save face a little bit if they're a little nervous. And And then I like to start with what's working well. I ask the class, we'll have a discussion on what's working well, what did you like, and, start with the positives. And then I like to move into almost discussing it like a piece of literature. I'll ask students, like, what did you feel while you were reading this piece? What are some of the themes or ideas that came up for you? And I found that question of themes and ideas is often really illuminating to the person being workshopped, because when you're writing a piece, you're not like necessarily thinking about themes and ideas. You're just trying to figure out how to make everything hold together. And so they often find that really illuminating. And then before we start giving the constructive criticism, I always pause and I say to the writer, do you have any specific questions you'd like to hear us talk about? So I still expect them to be quiet, but that gives them some agency and some ownership over the critical part of the conversation, where they can sort of steer in a certain direction, where they can say like, well, did the characters work here? Or I felt the dialogue was flat. What did people think? And then we can talk about anything. Sometimes people just say, I'm open to whatever you got. I don't really know what to do with this. But I find that if you create that more collaborative atmosphere where you're trying to help the class, help the writer accomplish what that writer is setting out to do. I think the worst sort of criticism is when someone says like, well, here's how I would do it, right? And they take whatever the piece is and they turn it into something completely different, right? Where it's like, well, that's a nice, mystery story, but what if we took it and turned it into a prose poem? Well, maybe that's interesting, but I think the writer's trying to write, this sort of thing. And so I think it's important to sort of give the writer sort of a voice to help them understand what is it they're trying to accomplish. So it's not necessarily about, is this objectively good or bad, but is it accomplishing what the writer hopes it will accomplish? Is it giving the reader the sort of experience that the writer hopes the reader will have?
I really appreciate how you'll give the writer a voice in their own workshop. I know that in my undergrad, we were kind of forced to sit there and and just take whatever criticisms came our way.
The most maddening thing sometimes, and people who have done a lot of workshops will eventually, I think, have this experience where people will talk for like 5 or 10 minutes about like a typo, and you're like, no, the character Doris doesn't exist. Like I just forgot to change her name to Doreen or whatever. Like, and people should be able to speak up, I think, and correct things to make the workshop like as useful as they can for accomplishing their goals. Yeah.
I do think that there is an objective component to it. I mean, I think that, but what I don't mean to say like that we all need to be emulating the exact same story because it's supposedly the best. Otherwise, our writing would all seem the same. No one wants that. But I do think that that objectively good writing can be expressed in different ways, and I guess a large portion of that objectivity would be being consistent in the style you've established, and being holding to the logic of the story that's already been established. Would you agree with all that?
I mean, I again to go back to Lewis and the experiment criticism. He says it's just a fact that some books offer us a richer experience than others. But as soon as you try to sort of quantify, like to pin it down, it sort of shifts. Because even in like consistency of style, you could get a book like Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, which is actually like 6 books or 7 books, sort of all sort of spread out, and it jumps from style to style in really interesting ways. Or I just finished a really interesting book called Magpie Murders, which is a mystery novel inside another mystery novel. And so I don't know. Like I do think obviously that some writing is better than other writing. I think like everyone knows that some books have worked better for them than others. But like the criteria of what makes for a good reading experience is so varied. There's so many different possible experiences you can have. That to me, it gets really hard to define like what, is this book objectively better than this book? unless the one book is like way out of the other's league, I think it's really hard and not necessarily a very fruitful sort of thing to think about. I don't know.
Yeah. No, yeah. Regardless of whether it can be objective or not, I mean, ultimately, your experience of fiction is going to trump whatever academic perspective you bring to it. Now, this is always a thorny question, but writers always get it. Are writers born or are they made?
No writer likes to answer that question. I've never read in any craft book where someone answers it particularly well. I think again, John Gardner, he has a book, another craft book called, I think, On Becoming a Novelist is the title. And he talks about this a little bit, and I think what he says is pretty good. That there are certain traits, there's certain sort of, I think, character traits that will help you become a better writer, that you kind of need to be a writer. I think a lot of writing can be learned, right? Like just like any art form, right? You can practice all sorts of different techniques of writing really vivid descriptions, or writing, really poetic prose, or writing really spare prose, writing good dialogue. Like you can practice all those techniques the same way. I don't know, you can practice scales if you're a musician, or you can, practice different types of brushstrokes if you're a painter. Mm. But Gardner lays out, and I think that what he lays out, I think he says like a writer should be a good observer of people. Flannery O'Connor says something similar. I think she says the writer's most important organ is the eye, right? That the writer needs to have a clear view of how the world really is. And so you need to observe people. I think you need to be interested in people. You kind of need to be a little bit of like a people watcher, I think. And just curious about like other people's lives and how do people see the world. And you need a love for language. I think it's John Gardner who says that, right, he asked a person, why did you become a painter? And the painter said, well, I just really like the smell of paint. Like, I just like being around paint. And so if you don't like words and sentences, you're not really going to like being a writer, I don't think. So I think writers, you have to have sort of a love for language and, all the possibilities of it, and, how you can write sentences, things like that. And I think you need to have a certain amount of stubbornness, you need to have a little bit of a perfectionist streak. You need to be kind of stubborn or determined, because it takes a long time to finish things. Even if it's a short story, it can take a long time to get it right. It can take a lot of drafts, and then it can take a lot of rejections before you find a place to publish it. And so you need to be driven. The writer Annie Dillard, in her book The Writing Life, she says, she tells a joke. She says, what's the difference between a writer and a shoe salesman? And she says, and it's a dark joke, she says, if the shoe salesman doesn't show up for work, people might miss him and ask about him. Whereas, like, if you don't show up at your computer to write the next chapter of your novel, Hollywood's not going to be like on the phone being like, well, did you do your writing today? So you have to be pretty self-motivated, I think. I think a lot of the techniques and stuff you can learn.
Yeah. The little pithy way I've come up with saying of answering the question would be, form can be learned, but no one can ever teach you to have something to say. I think that people can kind of bootstrap themselves into what we would call like good writers. But in terms of like ever having something original, thematically or whatever, just a new message, I think that there is a kind of intuition about that it might not be able to be taught. So does inspiration factor much into your writing, or are you pretty like regimented with your creative output?
So I love the days when the writing is really easy. Like hopefully everybody who's a writer has at least like one experience of like where you write the sentence and it writes the next sentence for you, and it writes the next sentence, and all of a sudden you have, a whole story. You just sat down and wrote it in one sitting. That's happened to me once or twice. But if I relied on that, I will have only written like 2 stories in my whole writer career. And so for me, I find it, particularly when I'm writing a first draft. So I said I'm finishing up this novel, and whenever I write new material for it, I would sit down in the morning. I would tell myself, okay, you have to write 300 words today. I had like a little Excel sheet where I was sort of, like, well, if you do 300 words a day, you will be at novel length by, you could do the math. And you're like, so if you do this, if you just stick with it, you will eventually have, in theory, enough material for a novel. Who knows if it will be shaped like a novel, right? Particularly if you're someone who sort of writes to sort of see what happens next and you don't outline enough. Sometimes you're like, that happened with my novella. I was like, how do I make this into a story? I just have a lot of scenes. But I would tell myself, you have to write, 300 words each day. And I would write about 50 words and I would sit there and be like, I hate this. I have no talent. Why did I decide to do this? This is ridiculous. And I would look at the clock and I'd be like, well, you've got 45 minutes before you have to go to work. So just keep going. And usually what would happen after I'd hit that point and push through it is something would click and I would write a bunch and I would look up and I would have, say, 600 words, which is like 2 double-spaced pages or maybe even more than that. Because I pushed through that and something like the gears loosened in my brain or something and things started actually turning and working the way they're supposed to. And so that 300 word mark was, was like a magic number for me where it's like, well, if you aim for that, you'll get more. Like it's short enough to be accomplishable, but it's long enough that I have to push through that initial feeling of frustration and discomfort and to sort of shut off my inner critics, sort of outrun them to say like, all right, we'll just keep going. And so that's a process that's worked pretty well for me. I'd like to try to get better. I'd like to maybe bump up to like, see, can I do 1,000 words? Right? Because I don't know. I guess the more you do it, the more confidence you get. I'm finally at a stage in my writing career where I'm starting to know a little bit more about what my process is and to be able to trust it, to feel like I don't have to get everything right the first try, that I know I can go back and make the dialogue better, or I can go back and get the character dynamics a little more true, things like that.
Yeah. Do you think that a fiction writer should have like a good work ethic, or in other words, like write even when they don't want to, or should they just kind of wait on inspiration, or is there kind of some middle ground?
So I think you have to write even when you don't feel like it if you want to complete a project. But that said, it can be good to take breaks and to get distance, especially coming out of like the pandemic lockdowns. I felt less creative, less driven, and it's been good for me. Before we started recording, I was telling Riley how I'm taking a break from writing, and I'm just building bookshelves as a way to sort of clear my head. And I'm going to take this week, and then I'm going to come back to writing next week. So I think breaks can be important and things like that. But I think also, particularly if you're working on a longer project, I find it really helpful for me. If I miss a day or two of working on a novel, I feel like I have to kind of go back. Like I lose all the threads, I lose the momentum. And so I try to make sure when I am writing that I'm writing, a little bit each day.
Yeah, that makes sense. What advice would you give to fiction writers who have like mitigating life circumstances, like like 70-hour work weeks, families, kids with health issues, or the writers themselves have depression or anxiety, or what would you say to them?
So I think those are two different issues. I think if you're a writer struggling with depression, you should talk to a counselor. That could addressing that will make writing a lot easier down the road, hopefully. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time, I think the trick is to make writing a priority, to try to take what little time you have and protect that. To say like, all right, every morning I'm going to write for a half hour. I'm going to wake up, a half hour earlier to give myself that chance to get that writing in, or I'm going to stay up, a little bit later to do a little bit of writing each day, or I'm going to block off Sunday afternoons, or I know that, one Saturday a month I'm going to be gone all day and I'm going to just write for that day, right? To whatever it is, whatever time makes sense, but just to make that a priority and to try to protect it a little bit. Especially with so many people working from home and with, you can check your email from home, even if you do have an office job, right? Or you can get text messages. Like my wife is in ministry, and so she'll get text messages from students, even into the evenings and things. And so it's important, I think, to set up boundaries if you can. And I know people with young children, I've heard it's sometimes it's helpful too to adjust like the scope of your project. That people who are raising very young children will sometimes take a break from novel writing and will work on poems or short stories or things that you can make meaningful progress on during the course of a nap. And the one other thing I would say is as you block off time for writing, remember that writing time doesn't have to be just like wall-to-wall typing. That writing is also reading, right? Like I often will read a little bit to sort of get my mind engaging with language and excited about sort of like storytelling possibilities. Sometimes writing time can be, going for a walk and sort of thinking through like, how does this scene play out before you sit down? Writing time can even be sending out submissions to magazines. And so that for me was helpful at different points in my life to realize that like, oh, when I say I'm writing, what I really mean is I'm working on my writing. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm typing, for a solid 45 minutes or something like that. Although sometimes it might.
Yeah. Can people make a living being a writer anymore?
Some people do. There are ways to do it. Right. I'm a full-time teacher. I'm a professor. So I teach English and creative writing classes. So I don't make a living off my writing, but it is something I am interested in exploring and learning how to do. There's a book I would highly recommend. It came out in 2018. I wish it had come out like 10 years ago when I was doing my MFA, but it's called The Business of Being a Writer by Jane Friedman. And she talks a lot about like different career paths for writers. She lays out the basics of like how publishing works, things like that, sort of different paths you can take, sort of traditional publishing, small press, independent publishing, independent or self-publishing, or small press publishing, like all these different paths. And one thing she stresses is that if you want to make a full-time living as a writer, you have to think about how you can create multiple streams of income. So no one, unless you're very, very fortunate, you have, a lot of really great books that are continuing to sell really well, like maybe a Stephen King or something like that. You have to think about, right, so much of your money will be made from book sales. And obviously the more books you have, the more books you can sell. So there are people who, like self-publishers who can make a living publishing, but they publish like 4 books a year or something like that. Maybe even more than that. And the kind of writer I am, that's not an option for me. But you want to think about how much money is coming in from book sales and how much money is coming in from, like if you have a Patreon or if you have a blog that you've monetized, if you teach classes, if you engage in sort of speaking. So you want to sort of think about how do you build the whole thing together? Do you do freelance editing? Like there's a lot of different things, but you kind of have to cobble it together, most people.
And what about making a living as a Christian writer?
I mean, for me, I think that term Christian writer is one that like has like in our culture sometimes has like weird sort of marketing connotations to it. That like when I hear Christian writer, I think about like Amish romance novels and things like that. Whereas I tend to think about myself as I'm a Christian who writes and I'm a writer who is a Christian. And so I think, the multiple streams of income, all of that would still apply if you're a Christian writer.
Okay. Do you think that there are any writers right now we should keep an eye on that might be up and coming?
Yeah. I actually jotted down a couple. There's a writer named Tyler James Russell. He was actually, his poetry was featured in issue 1 of Solum. A magazine I used to edit called Dog Pond. We published one of his stories, a really weird story called Goat Boy. But he, I think just last year came out with a collection of poetry called How to Drown a Man that I think is just really great. I think he's coming out with a novel sometime next year. So that would be one writer to keep an eye on. I also got to meet a poet recently named Shanna Paulus Wheeler, who has a great book called Evensong for Shadows, that I think a lot of listeners to this podcast would like. And then an old classmate of mine, Melissa Goodrich. I think I think people should read more of her fiction. I think she should be more well known. She has just really great, really inventive stuff. She once described her stories. A lot of her fiction is about things changing into other things. She has a really great story that's kind of about anxiety called The Girl Who Turns to White Rabbits. And so it's this very, very fun sort of magic realist sort of story about a girl who literally turns into white rabbits when she starts to feel anxious and what her life is like. And so she has some really interesting stuff if people would look her up. That's Melissa Goodrich.
So what practical advice would you give to aspiring Christian writers? Like, where should people submit, and how do they find agents? Do they even need agents? Just stuff like that.
So I would say get that book, The Business of Being a Writer by Jane Friedman. It lays all that stuff out a lot better than I ever could. I think specifically to Christian writers, the advice I would give is to spend some time thinking about how you understand your faith and art as working together. I think that, you can learn how to be a good writer. And obviously there are churches and things that can teach you how to grow in your faith. But a lot of writers I meet who are Christians or artists in general who are Christians, sometimes they can't quite articulate how those two facets of their identity sort of interact and nourish each other. And so I would encourage Christian writers to spend some time thinking about that. And there's some great books out there. I mentioned, I think earlier, Walking on Water by Madeline L'Engle. That was a book that really helped me sort of think about these things. Brett Lott has a book called Letters in Life that's pretty good. Ron Hansen has one called A Stay Against Confusion. Flannery O'Connor obviously has a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to say about this sort of stuff. But yeah, I would say think about that. And I would say read other Christian writers, read the greats, sort of figure out how do they do it? How do they pull this off? How do they write about faith in ways that both Christians and non-Christians find really compelling? Image Magazine, I think on their website has a great 100 list of 100 writers of faith. That's a really great starting point if you're wondering sort of how do I find these writers? And obviously look at Christian literary magazines like Solum. I really like Ruminate and Dappled Things. Image is a big one. The Wind Hover. There's a fair number of them out there, but you kind of have to look.
Now, as the fiction editor for Solum Press, what do you look for in fiction submissions?
So I think first of all, I look for stories that are engaging, whether it be through language, whether it gives me characters that I really can empathize with and maybe even root for. And that doesn't mean the characters have to be heroic or even good people. I think some of the, I think about Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, right? You kind of root for him even as he does terrible things, right? But characters who are complex and interesting and who you want things to happen, right? You want good things to happen to them, right? You're rooting for them. Again, language and voice, I really love sentences that just sound great. And then I look for, does the story have a resonance with Christianity? So it doesn't necessarily, like I said, I think all truth belongs to God. If it's true, it's true. And I don't look for stories that are didactic, but I think about it in terms of sort of resonating with a Christian outlook.
Okay. And just in closing, Ryan, as part of Solum, what do you hope that Solum will ultimately accomplish?
So I'd love to see us create a space for Christian literary writers to publish their stuff, to get their names out there, to discover other writers who hold similar outlooks and similar values. I think some Christian writers can feel both they don't completely fit into the literary scene, and they don't completely fit into their church. They're not quite fully understood in either place. And so I would love for Solon to be a place where people are understood, both those identities overlap here. And then I also really like the interdisciplinary vision you have for the magazine, Riley, because I think the church in general, there's so much great literature out there, and that it amazes me that there's not, copies of these magazines, in the foyers of churches all over the place, because there's really a lot of great art being produced, and it would be great if we could see churches support the Christian artists in their midst a little bit more, and to be a little bit more aware of them as they're developing, as they're kind of coming up, and not just when they make it big,
Yeah. Again, I just want to say how much I appreciate your help with Solum, and we just, it's just such a blessing to have you on. So thanks for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Alrighty. Well, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.